Today we're digging into one of those incredible legal cases, a real David and Goliath story. Except in this case, it was a giant insurance corporation going head-to-head with an entire nation's parliament. This is the story of how a fight over asbestos scars literally redrew the map of power in Scotland. So, let's get right to it. The core question here is just massive. Can one company, a private business, actually challenge and maybe even strike down a law that was passed by a democratically elected parliament? It's a huge deal, and the answer, as you'll see, had some pretty major consequences. But, to really get what this legal fight was all about, we have to go back and understand the human story behind it, because this whole thing starts with a public health crisis that was brewing under the surface for decades. For generations, in shipyards, on construction sites, in factories, thousands and thousands of workers were breathing in asbestos dust. It was this hidden, silent danger. And then, years, sometimes decades later, it would cause these absolutely devastating health problems for so many families across Scotland. Okay, so this whole case zeroes in on a very specific medical condition called pleural plaques. Now, what are they? They're basically areas of scarring on the lungs. And while the plaques themselves aren't cancerous and are often harmless, they act as this terrifying biological marker. It's a sign that says, you've been exposed to asbestos, and now you're at a much, much higher risk of getting a deadly disease down the line. So, faced with this growing crisis, the Scottish Parliament decided it had to do something. It had to act. But their solution, well, let's just say it turned out to be incredibly controversial. So here's how it all went down. For a long time, people diagnosed with these pleural plaques could actually claim compensation, not for the plaques themselves, but for the anxiety and the risk they now had to live with. But then boom, in 2007, a court ruling just ended that right, saying the condition wasn't a real injury. So the Scottish Parliament stepped in. 2 years later, in 2009, they passed their own law to basically say, no, we disagree, and reverse that court's decision. The new act was crystal clear. It was designed specifically to restore the right for people with pleural plaques to sue their old employers for damages. And that, of course, meant suing their employers' insurance companies. Parliament had spoken. But that was not the end of it. Not by a long shot. It was really just the beginning of a massive legal war, because the insurance industry was getting ready to fight back. Hard. So a whole group of big-name insurance companies, with AXA right at the front, didn't waste any time. They immediately launched a legal challenge, arguing that the Scottish Parliament had gone too far and that this new law was just fundamentally unlawful. And this really boils it down to the two clashing views. On one side, you had AXA. They argued that this new law violated their human rights, specifically their right to enjoy their property. They said by creating this huge new financial liability, the government was basically taking their possessions. And by possessions, they meant their money. But on the other side, the Scottish government said, hang on, this is about social justice. It is Parliament's job to decide how to protect and compensate victims. Now, before the judges could even think about who was right, they had to tackle this really technical but absolutely crucial legal idea called standing. In Scotland, they used to call it title and interest. Think of it like this. To get into a stadium to watch a game, you need a ticket, right? Well, in the legal world, standing is your ticket. You have to prove you have a real, direct connection to the issue to even be allowed in the courtroom. So, this led to a really fascinating question. I mean, yeah, sure, AXA obviously had a financial stake, but was their ticket strong enough to let them challenge the will of an entire democratically elected parliament? That was a huge hurdle they had to get over first. The whole fight went all the way to the UK Supreme Court. And this is where it all comes to a head. The stakes were unbelievably high, and the court's final decision would go down as a true landmark in Scottish legal history. And this quote from Lord Hope, one of the top judges on the case, just perfectly captures the court's thinking. What he's saying here is fundamental. Yes, Parliament makes the laws, but it's the job of the courts, the judges, to make sure those laws actually follow the rules. They get the final say on what is and what isn't lawful. So what was the final call? Well, there were two huge outcomes. First, the insurance companies lost their case. The Supreme Court said the act was a totally legitimate piece of social policy and didn't violate their rights. The law was safe. But here's the kicker, and this is maybe even more important. The court used this case to completely change the rules on who could bring a legal challenge in Scotland and confirmed that, yes, courts absolutely have the power to review acts of the Scottish Parliament. And really, it's that second part of the decision
that created this massive ripple effect, a legacy that has completely reshaped Scottish law.
So here's the legacy, broken down. First, access to justice got a whole lot wider. The court basically threw out that old restrictive ticket system and brought in a much more modern test. Do you have a sufficient interest? This was a game changer, making it easier for regular people and public interest groups to challenge the government. And finally, the case struck this new, delicate balance of power. It said, yes, the Scottish Parliament has the power to legislate, but it also made it clear that the courts are there as the ultimate referee, holding them to account.
So when you boil it all down, it's pretty amazing, isn't it? A case that started with physical scars on the lungs of workers ended up leaving a permanent mark on the entire legal and political landscape of Scotland. It really did redraw the map.
And all of this leaves us with one final, fascinating question to chew on. In a democracy like this, where the parliament is elected by the people, but the courts are the guardians of the law, who really gets the final word? This case didn't just give us a legal answer, it forced us to keep asking a very important political one.